Capital Markets Conference, and we have the incredible honor and privilege of having the Deputy Minister of Finance with us. Thank you so much for doing this. We really appreciate your time here.
Thank you.
And
Thank you for having me.
obviously, no stranger to the show, our good friend Simba. One of the conversations that we had here that I thought was quite constructive and progressive is the conversation about trust between the private sector and the government. And one of my biggest gripes as a person who's in the private sector and in the business community is that those of us on the other side of the ledger, we don't engage government. And we tend to think we have this, and to the extent that we do engage with government, our attitude tends to be adversarial,
Right.
like we have different agendas. When actually, what's great for me, right, I would love to have a year in which I'm paying millions in taxes, right? Because it means my business is thriving, right? And if I'm paying millions in taxes, it means the state, the fiscus,
Sure.
is actually
Benefiting.
significantly,
Yeah.
and we both win. So I think that our interests are intertwined.
Yes.
And to the extent that the formal sector shrinks and people like me become poorer, the state also becomes poorer to the extent that you collect this in taxes.
Vicious cycle. Yeah.
So I'm delighted that I think we're on the same page in that we certainly have a lot to gain
Sure.
from building that bridge.
Yeah.
But I'd love to hear your take in terms of somebody you spend most of your life outside government.
Yep.
What's the transition been like?
So maybe let's go back to the trust issue. It's after hours.
Yeah, sure. And
the
we're having a
people
drink.
And people need to
Cheers.
trust that the
Cheers.
treasury guys are not having drinks during work hours.
Yes,
so,
yes,
you know,
yes.
Definitely after.
ties are off so we can have a candid discussion.
Fantastic.
But like you said, this has been a good platform of bringing the government and private sector together and dialogue in not so much of the conventional manner where you have your ZNCCs or your CZIs, but all the players actually here in the same room and putting government to task. You asked me earlier on what has been my perception and view of how the private sector views government and the relationship that has been there, which a lot of people testify to is, government is there as an institution. You have to have a government. You can't do away with it. Government comes out with policy because that's what they have to do. As the private sector, we're just going to sit back, fold our hands, wait for the next SI to come, and find ways to, navigate around it if it's a policy that we don't like. That's the relationship that's been there, that's somewhat still there. But I think what we needed to do was to unpack what Vision 2030 is, which has become a soundbite of government, of politicians, but at a granular level is not really related to the private sector, to the capital markets. And it's not just about, the matrix of reaching a GNI per capita of, 4,000 to 12,000 or 13,000, whatever it is, because that can be achieved by having huge exports in your mining, for example. You still can achieve an upper middle income economy by virtue of having, large imports without it being translated to the ordinary people. His Excellency's vision is that the quality of life of our people matches that of our regional neighbors who are enjoying upper middle income status. So that means even at a private sector level, if you're in telecoms or whatever service you're providing, let it be the same as our regional neighbors. In 2021, which was when this first strategy of the two strategies that are going to come towards Vision 2030, it would have been very difficult to explain to the private sector, to players that indeed, without inviting foreign companies to come and do our roads, we can actually do them. We can surpass agricultural targets that have been there for the past 50 years we can do so much as a people. His Excellency started conscientizing our people, both in government, in politics, and the private sector, that nyika inovakwa nevene vayo. This isn't just rhetoric around politics, but a philosophy where as Zimbabweans we need to realize that we can actually do this as a people. But that can only happen if we do it together. For those who've taken time to read NDS1 or even Vision 2030, you'll find that there's huge emphasis on a private sector-led economy. And the whole idea around this is that the private sector will always move faster than government. So what government has done is set the pace and shown Zimbabweans in business, even socially, that we can do this. But it's time for the private sector to now come in and run with this vision. Let's take over these infrastructure projects that government was predominantly doing. It's a space that we shouldn't be in the first place. But a template was needed. It's there. Our people have been capacitated to be able to do the work. So let the private sector come in. I'm still getting to your question. You're asking how was the transition? We're still getting to the after hours and the trust and distrust between government. Look, there's so many aspects that come to it. When you're in the private sector and you fault government for a lot of things, and then you go into the space where you can actually make the changes to some of the ills that you could see that were afflicting you in your personal business, and then you realize how complicated government can be. Not just because of the bureaucracy, but because of the responsibility that government has. It's very easy in our own corners of business, of enterprise, of whatever we're doing, to know what needs to be done, but to be able to extrapolate that to a point where you understand how your area can affect even someone in Lotito, in Njombe, down in Binga, might not even come to mind because that's not your role. That's the role of government. So each and every policy has to be dissected, and you make sure that there is that distributive effect to get us to Vision 2030, where the quality of life for our people matches that of our neighbors. So there's quite a huge task. But with that said, it is good to come in with a different perspective in how to do things. Also learning from bureaucracy, which I've learned is not an entirely bad thing. Those checks and balances are actually necessary to make sure that indeed you make the right decision. So it's been a bittersweet sort of journey the last 9 months, I'll say.
Oh, fantastic!
Yeah.
And what would you say to a lot of people who want Zimbabwe to do well, who found success in the private sector, but have this image of government as this place when there's just red tape, it's hard to get things done, you're going to be vilified, right? Because, we live in a country where there's a whole cohort of people who, no matter what the policy action is, it's going to be viewed through this lens of it's bad, it's evil, it's going to fail, all right? And, so what would you say to people, who are educated, who are patriotic, but have, they have this legitimate trepidation?
Right. So first of all, I've had to come to terms with the fact that when you're in government, you're unpopular. It's very difficult to be popular when you're in government, and rightly so. There's no decision that you can make that can please everybody. But what we're doing as the Minister of Finance is trying to make sure that our open door policy is actually an open door policy. I think you'll notice over the last few months there have been a lot more engagements, which is a call to the private sector to actually come to the table. If we're going for a budget review or for a budget, let's come together while there's still time and ventilate on issues. And let's not fold our hands and wait for a bad piece of policy to come out when you're not part of the process. There are budget consultations. There are all these fora that are put in place that are supposed to bridge government and the private sector. And we are listening, but you can only listen to those who come to the table. So, 8 or 9 out of 10 of the times, the policy that you see is born out of the people who actually participated in the process. If you are an entrepreneur who's made money and you believe that there is a policy that can be good for your business, for your industry, and for the generality, you need to come to the table. Because when you sit back, those views are not heard.
For sure.
So my call and my rallying call would be, let's come to the table. It's so much easier now. You've got a lot of people who are now conscientized to the need that, look, we need to talk to the private sector because it is enunciated in the vision. How do you have a private sector-led economy if the private sector does not come in the policy-making process? So this is something that, we're fully cognizant of, and that needs to be done. We've gone halfway. Private sector needs to come the other half.
So you've been a capital allocator for 15, 20 years. Do you get the sense that the dialogue between the capital markets and the private sector, the broader private sector, has changed? Or this is the first time we've had the opportunity to access officials this high up in government. What's your sense?
I think I get the sense that the needle is actually moving. I had the pleasure, I'm not sure if you remember, but there was a ZAPF conference in Bulawayo, and you were the guest of honor as well.
Is this sometime last year, maybe November?
Exactly, yeah. And I did indicate that, no matter how bright the ideas we have, the ingenuity we have, we need macroeconomic stability to actually benefit going forward. Yeah. And I think from even the discussions that we had today, you can see the emphasis that government has in bringing that macroeconomic stability. I think there's that recognition that before we can even put a first foot forward, we need macro stability. And even for the private sector to participate in these well-meaning projects. If I'm a pension fund, for example, and I want to take over a road, that's a 15, 20-year project. It's going to need me to rope in a lot of stakeholders to come in. I need to know that for the next 5, 10 years, the money that I put in, I can gradually come back and award my fiduciaries, which are the pensioners at the end of the day. So I'm actually glad that in terms of what's happening with the introduction of the ZIG, the government is emphasizing that stability. And it's also not threatening even the local nostro balances to say, let's maintain that stability as we go forward and not have a harsh approach to the currency environment, but let's do it gradually. So I am seeing the needle moving in the right direction. And I think in terms of us having that increased confidence, it's going to be that policy consistency as we go forward. So it is quite a breath of fresh air in that regard.
Right. And on policy consistency, I mentioned it earlier on.
Yeah, I need to revise my...
let's call it policy refinement. Whenever something comes and it's good for the industry, you'll find that we came from a very turbulent time within our markets. Sometimes you had to create policy to deal with symptoms, which is not the right way to do things, but look, it's there. You're dealing with the situation. And as you go along, maybe certain policies are not fit for purpose. And either they have to be refined or replaced or something new has to come in. So you will find that on our journey to a fully de-dollarized economy, because that's where we're going. We're on a roadmap. Right now, we are probably 80 to 85% US dollars and 15 to 20% local currency. As that gradual change happens, a lot of things will happen in the economy. So there will need to be refinements. I'm not trying to prep people for inconsistent policy, but I'm just saying that sometimes through regulation, you have to make sure that we maintain that macroeconomic stability. And right now, government is fully focused on making sure that we safeguard currency stability, which was the only piece left in our macroeconomic stability framework that threatened the whole infrastructure. So this is something that will always keep our fingers on the pulse. And if anything comes up, we will not fear refining for the sake of being called inconsistent. I just need to put that out there because I think we sort of have to disambiguate between inconsistency and refinement as we go along, as we go on.
I think an example of that is even when the ZiG was introduced, and there's the official rate, then there's the rates that the supermarkets could use. But I could get the sense that it's refinement because there's SI 81 of 2024 which came in to say, look, people are actually not accessing that money at the official rate. They're actually accessing it at the rate that banks are giving them the money. So if people are accessing it at a slightly higher rate, we also need to translate that feasibility in the supermarket. So I think I get that sense of refinement to say these are uncharted waters. We're trying to bring stability in the market,
So
but you're
let's
also
not confine ourselves
So
to-
you're also listening to the feedback from the market. It's almost a feedback loop.
Where I'll certainly give the government credit is that they will make changes, which didn't happen in the previous dispensation when it's clear that something isn't working.
Right.
But I do think that there have been instances in which we take a policy action where, with the benefit of 2020 hindsight, there's certain conversations that could have been had that would have avoided the need for the refinement in the first instance. But I think, and I want to return to this theme because I think it's really important if we're going to actually make any progress in our country over the next few years, and in fact, just in general as a principle.
Right.
Because, the government's not going anywhere.
It's always going to be there. It's going to leave all of us.
We're gonna leave them. It's gonna stay around.
And if you're an economic player, if you're doing business, you've got to do business with the government of the day. And I think that we need to have a constructive approach to our interaction and engagement with government. Otherwise we're just not going to get the outcomes that we're looking for, and we're going to be poorer, and things aren't going to be great for the government of the day either. Right? And so one of the things that what you launched today was this Capital Markets Association, which is basically a lobby for the capital markets to interact more with government. And I think that's a fantastic initiative from, and I'm delighted that you made time to come out here to launch it and talk to us about it. And I think if we can bridge the trust gap between the private sector and the government, we will have less disagreements about policy action because we will be working more in sync together. So that's something that that's a theme that I feel quite strongly about, and I'm delighted that even just the idea of having you here, having this conversation, is fantastic.
Yeah.
And I would really want to take this opportunity to encourage my colleagues in the private sector, in the business community, to engage more, and your colleagues as well.
Sure.
To the extent that they have a perspective that they want to share with the business community.
Right.
Our platform is available to them. And when we get people here, we're not trying to ask you gotcha questions and shame you or,
I'm used to the tough questions. And,
we're just trying to have a conversation and just understand better where you're coming from.
Frank discussions will breed the trust that we talk about. So the distrust comes from dishonesty. That is where trust is broken, whether it's on the private sector side or from the government side. The moment that we start having frank and honest discussions, it's part of the trust building process. But that goes actually further to everybody sticking to their word. And I would like to say both the private sector and government have been equally culpable in certain instances. But if there's an opportunity right now where you've got the CMA, the Capital Markets Association as a lobby group, it makes the open door policy a bit easier. Before, I mentioned that, look, you can have 100 individuals coming, but from the same sector. But if you've got a group that represents everybody's interests, it is then easier to litmus test if government is listening or not. Because here's the capital markets, they've come, they've put in their concerns as a grouping, and government puts in a policy that's 180 degrees, then you know that we're not congruent. I'm not saying that government and the private sector or CMA will agree all the time, but where there are points of departure, it's always good to agree to disagree because you understand where I'm coming from. That's how you build trust. That look, government is not doing what we asked for, but their reasons are somewhat justified. Or I think that's how we can start this conversation. It's a journey again towards 2030.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah.
Simba, I think one of the things that is not well understood about our capital market, and perhaps you're going to articulate this for the Honorable Deputy Minister and for the benefit of our audience, is what our capital markets could actually bring to the party in terms of raising money for whether it's to do Harare Chirundu, whether it's to raise money to deal with the 2 billion that we need for food security. I think very often our market has been vilified, but on the other side, if you look at it through a positive lens, our market could actually be the catalyst that brings in billions in capital, and I think there are examples of this happening in other markets that you can articulate.
So let's not even go far. Let's go to South Africa. The biggest investor in their stock market is the Public Investment
Commission.
They are responsible for the bulk of even the housing projects in South Africa as well. And the reason why they can actually do that is because they've got the platform to invest money long term.
Yeah.
So I'm happy that I keep coming back to the issue of macroeconomic stability because it opens so many doors. Opening up a highway, for example, it's not a 1-year project, 2-year project.
No.
It's a very long-term project. And instead of government using taxpayers' money to actually build a road, they could actually be using that money to, build hospitals, social investment in education, and we deal with the commercial side of some of those investments. Because, like the Honorable Minister is actually saying that they want a private sector-led economy, and that's where we fit in. Even some of the less conventional type investments, where we invest in fintechs or innovation hubs, where we're trying to also invest in new innovations that can actually come, and we've got the capital that's structured to take on that risk.
Right.
There's so many examples. I mean, if we go to America and we see the Facebooks of this world, they were equity financed. Facebook didn't make money for 20 years, but they were just getting capital injections. Can a government actually do that for a fintech, for example? So there is a space where we can actually take over based on what the government has created in terms of the environment. So I'm quite excited in that regard.
I agree 100%. Government has no emotional attachment to any of these infrastructure projects of the roads. I mentioned earlier on that right now we're actually negotiating something with Africa 50 for asset recycling. So the completed projects that we do have, let us find ways to release equity from those. Have a financier come, run a feasibility. How much do they think they can collect from this road over a period of time? Front load that, and then we can do another road. Well, why does it have to be Africa 50? I think our own capital markets can actually do the same.
Do that,
Ultimately, we want a robust pensions industry, which means that you need to have investments that generates the necessary cash flows to allow that, so that our parents can retire and the young people can actually get into the market. Right now, we've got a skewed economic situation where you've got a large base of young people and a smaller base that's unable to retire because of the erosion that happened on their pension funds, which is something that we're working on rectifying. So it's something that is an ecosystem that actually needs everybody to come to the table. Corporates, if working with governments, can maximize on their profits. I don't imagine how one can grow to their fullest extent if they're not coming to the table in terms of proffering the policy and the environment that they believe can make them grow bigger. It's easier to sidestep and then grow in a very small way. But if you have government as your partner, for example, it can be so much bigger. We shouldn't have to be going to all these conferences trying to raise money. you should be going to Singapore, to Hong Kong,
To bring
armed
that
with a
money.
government guarantee or the letter of support that, look, he's one of our guys. If you give him money for this road, we'll guarantee that if it fails, we'll pay you. That's the role of the private sector. And I think that's the way we're viewing this relationship going forward.
No, that's fantastic. I think one of the areas that certainly nothing has happened over the last, throughout my career anyway, where you have people in the private sector actually raising money directly for government, whether it's at a municipal level for cities or at a national level in terms of TBs. I think that there's scope for the government to use the capital markets to raise money directly, locally, and from foreigners. But I think the reason that hasn't happened isn't because everybody in government thinks it's a bad idea. I think it's just that when you look at the capital market players, I think the relationship hasn't been there. I think it's been viewed through this lens of they're not really on our side. And so we can't work with them on this, which is why we don't have any listed treasury bills. We don't have a yield curve. If you phone a bank CEO tomorrow and ask how much in US dollar TBs are outstanding in the market, they don't know. It's because treasury
It's not public knowledge anymore.
treats that as a secret because treasury doesn't trust. But I think if we can build a bridge between the banking sector and the rest of the private sector and government, then you probably be surprised that you can have a conversation in which you can actually raise multiples of what's outstanding today. But you just haven't had the conversation.
So, first of all, the private sector, banks, I have to see that government is walking the talk. We had a monetary policy. I think everything was quite clear. I think the proof of the pudding is in the eating.
For sure.
Which means that when you see government walking the talk, and we then come back to you, the macroeconomic stability issues are now shelved and are issues of yesteryear. We don't have to have that past trauma blinding our decision making. So that was a key step in making sure that the relationship between government and the private sector becomes one where we can actually build our national discourse. And I think we're now at that space where we can start having these discussions. Hence, conferences like this. You now have a new lobby, CMA. There's some issues with the banks. I think they also have to come to the party. I'm not going to talk about it on this platform. I don't want to say the wrong thing.
Yeah, sure. And people shouldn't take us too seriously. We're just having a
But I think everybody has a part to play to make sure that our people are not poorer by putting faith in institutions that traditionally they should be trusting.
Yeah, 100%.
So these are discussions that we need to have, frankly and honestly, before we can move on and making sure that our people are prosperous.
So from where you're sitting, because I think we are quite we make a lot of noise, and we are given to being very critical in our assessment of government policy sometimes. But I think it's only fair that we have the humility to ask from your perspective. When you look at the business community, where are we coming short, or what do you think we ought to be doing differently in terms of just moving our country forward?
So critique is a good thing, in my opinion. It's important that the areas where you have blind side, areas that you should be improving, areas that you should look out for. So it's something that even as government we should not be shunning. So I would not take critique as a bad thing. But in our critique, let us be positive and patriotic. that conscientization and the new philosophy of that of Nikanoa Konevenoayo. I mean, when you take it to a granular level, there's no one else. It's just us as Zimbabweans. There's no government.
No one is coming to save us.
No one's coming to save us.
It's us.
There's no Zimbabweans in government and Zimbabweans in private. It's everybody, which means that any solutions that we come up with have to be a Zimbabwean solution. Zimbabwean is composed of a government, a private sector, of civil society, politicians, business people, a whole host. So we need to make sure that in our social contract of building our country, we're patriotic. And this is what makes countries like the United States, like China, lead in their national discourse. They can agree on smaller issues, but when it comes to the grander picture of making their countries move forward, they all agree. So as business, when you sidestep policy instead of actually confronting government and coming with alternative solutions that work, that becomes somewhat unpatriotic. That's less money going to the tax base, and that's more pressure on the already formal economy that has a lot of pressure on it already, and
for sure,
it's a self-defeating cycle. So if we can all come together and make sure that, look, we're coming from a very complicated period where it's even difficult to put a finger on anything or how we've been surviving, but we've made it as Zimbabweans. We just need to now restructure and make sure that we have real rules of conduct. I think a lot of people have been operating as cowboys.
That's true.
Institutions are not held sacred anymore. At least as Zimbabweans, if we can all agree, whether you're corrupt or you're honest or whatever, let's all agree that you do not touch the currency. Don't mess with our currency because it's our national pride.
Yeah.
If we can come to a point where we all agree that, what, this is our baby as Zimbabwe, let's all respect this. Let's respect institutions. Let's respect the Reserve Bank. It doesn't matter what you're doing. Let's respect this institution. We need to have a code of conduct as market players, as market makers, as market recipients, and agree on a discourse that can make everybody prosperous outside. So this is the part that the private sector needs to play. Let's come to the table. Let's be conscious that what we're doing now is not just for this generation, but for the next. I mentioned, we've got a 67% youthful population. That means 35 and below are the majority. What that means is that the decisions that we're making now are decisions of today and of the next generation. Any move you make, this drink here can actually affect, 40 years from now, a whole generation. So we need to make sure that we're always fully conscious of what we're doing, how we're doing it, and the impact it will have on our kids and our grandkids. I think we have a huge responsibility, especially as young people of today.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I completely agree. The producers jumping up and down. We were supposed to do like just 20 minutes, and it's just evaporated. But we have a studio in Harare, and we have much longer shows, and we would love to have you and
even his colleagues as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Feel the joy from within with the new natural joy juice drink. Passion coconut, apple coconut, and lychee coconut exotic flavors. Available in 1 liter and 250 ml packs at a store near you. Natural joy juice drink. Joy in every sip.
Welcome everybody. We're having a fantastic time here at the Capital Market Conference in Nyanga in the middle of winter, which is why we're all having a pre-dinner drink with Andy and Simba. And we just thought we'd capture some of the energy from the conference and discuss some of the issues that we think would be of interest to you, our audience. So, Andy, you've been a fantastic MC, and it would be remiss if I didn't give you an opportunity to just thank our hosts and sponsors. and maybe give us your perspective
Yeah.
of the day so far.
Well, I'd like to thank, of course, Zimbabwe Independence. They brought us all together here. And I think this is a critical conference because I suppose, let's start from the beginning. I think we need to start at the basics this. And I think talking to our audience is what exactly is capital markets and why is it important for individuals to understand what the capital markets is and maybe even to participate in it. And I think that's one area that we haven't really discussed properly and we haven't really, which today hopefully we've achieved, is to set up an association that can do that. Now, first of all, capital markets, of course, are those markets outside what you normally do. So, for example, you have the cash market, your transactional market, what you do normally. But then you have the capital markets, which is really around investment for those who want to invest, and those who want to raise funding can do it in that market. Now, Zimbabwe has a long track record of having a very strong capital markets environment. We had it. We used to have it. I myself used to deal derivatives, forwards, contracts. I mean, you name it, I dealt them. Right now, what do? We don't do very much. There's very few products. But however, I will say that products have come up. You got ETFs, you got REITs, you've got the CSDs, for example. But the point is this, is that why should capital markets be important to Zimbabweans? And when you look at the numbers, only 2% of people in the country understand what capital markets are. And I think if we start at that basis, then we can lead into why are we sitting in Inyanga right now with all the practitioners, all the stakeholders that are required in capital markets, and what are we talking about today? And I think that is where I'd like to start with. I'd like to start with the fact that why should it matter? Let me give you some statistics. If you look at Asia, for example, and you look at how many people are trading in the stock market, people who own stocks, you may be talking about maybe 60%. America, the numbers are still the same. You look all around the world, it's a way that people can make money. And they can also lose money, of course. But the point is this, in Zimbabwe, it's 0.00001%. Yeah. All investors on the capital markets are institutional investors, pension funds, companies, and so forth. But me and you as people, we don't invest. What do we like? We like houses and cars. We love our cars, don't we? We love our houses. Yeah. But what we should be thinking of is
and farms.
And farms. Yeah, let's not forget that. But we should be thinking about how can we attain wealth in the medium and long term. And we can do that by investing in capital markets, which in essence is the heartbeat of our economy.
Absolutely. Quite right.
Fantastic. And so when I grow up, I also want to make so much money as a trader, investment banker, that I can retire and just be an MC.
That'd be nice, wouldn't it? Yeah. You want my job then? But I think what we've done today in the last today in particular, in the next 2 days, is that we've really looked at what are the issues surrounding the capital markets. What needs to be done to make them more transparent, more effective, more people reachable, if I can put it that way. What needs to be done at a policy level, at a regulatory level, at an operational level, so that we can actually grow the capital markets? Because without capital markets and depth of capital markets, we can't hope, I must be frank, we can't really hope to grow certain aspects of our economy. Let's say you want to raise money, right, for your business. Where do you go? You go to the stock exchange, you go to capital markets, you issue instruments like bonds and all that sort of thing so that you can raise capital for your business, okay? At the moment, that is so low that it's frightening. Where do people raise money in Zimbabwe to grow their business? And I think that is the key question. And the answer is capital markets.
Yeah.
So if you actually think about our country at the moment, call us a 20 billion GDP country. And the numbers that we talk about in terms of the things that we want to achieve, whether it's for infrastructure development, whether it's to deal with the drought and food security.
Yes.
We're talking, $2 billion here, a few $1 billion there. And one of the remarkable things that happened over the last couple of weeks is that a company founded in March 2023, right? That doesn't own any natural resources, that doesn't own, vast tracts of land or patents even, right? Just basically founded on an idea that they can put together a bunch of really smart people and build AI, was able to raise $6 billion, right? Just last week, less than 2 years after founding, right? Which is Elon Musk's AI, right? But here in this part of the world, the idea of raising $1 billion, $5 billion, $10 billion seems like it's really, really hard. And I always, make the argument that if we had the right framework in our country, given our rich natural resource endowment, we could easily raise 5, 10, 20 billion. Now, you are actually someone who's involved in running a significant portfolio of resource-rich companies. And I suspect that you've been in a bunch of conversations where you've talked to people about raising money. So what's your perspective? Because I think that's what you're bringing to the conference in terms of as a capital market player, because you're on the demand side.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Why can't we raise billions here?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think maybe that's partly why we're all here, right? This is an inaugural capital markets conference, which should be very surprising to anyone because this is 2024. And we just talked earlier about how in Africa, certainly, Zimbabwe is was at least for a long time, one of the more advanced capital markets on the continent. So I think that clearly something went wrong in the development of those capital markets. But also, I think Andy did say something that was quite profound when he said, look, when we look at ourselves, there are certain things that we don't think about. And one of them is getting involved in the various ways that our capital markets can touch the ordinary person. And I think that when people talk about depth of capital market, this is what they mean. So in Zimbabwe and in Africa generally, we have a lack of depth and a lack of breadth, right? So there are not enough participants in our capital markets, and there is not enough capital in our capital markets.
Liquidity.
There's both liquidity and even just maybe let me you ruin my train of thought there, but let me go back slightly.
Sorry.
Definitely there's not enough liquidity because, as you rightly pointed out, a lot of people invest in real estate, whether it's companies or individuals. And real estate actually sucks liquidity out of the market, right? Because you are taking a liquid cash, whether it's from a bank or from your own savings and actually buying something that doesn't produce anything anymore outside of rent after that most of the time. Yep. So I do think that we lack the adequate breadth and the adequate depth in our economy for us to raise the amounts of money that are required. Now, when we then look at what we have in terms of natural resources, because I wanted to touch, as you know, until recently I was running a mining group. Yeah? So, and my experience is that we have what the world needs, and that is the resources that we have.
Yeah,
and
name
because
it. BTM, gold.
Does not matter what it is.
It doesn't matter. Even food.
Correct. And because for some reason we are blessed as a nation and as a continent with the fact that when the world moves to the next new thing, we are the ones who have it.
Exactly.
Right? It's certainly from a primary resource perspective. We are the ones who have it. So we could take advantage of the capital markets, the international capital markets that do have the depth and the breadth to raise money for our needs, for our resources. And I feel like we are not doing that well enough. And hopefully this is part of the conversation that we are having at this conference.
If I may, I also think that we have a mentality. Our mentality is someone else out there is going to do it for us. I think it's about time that we as Africa, and Zimbabwe in particular, understood that we actually have the controlling boot on our foot.
Yeah, correct.
It isn't them that must dictate to us, it's us that must dictate to them.
Yes.
When you talk about lithium, we have the sixth largest deposit of lithium. Correct. Look at chrome, look at iron ore, look at the people resources that we have.
Yeah.
We're second to none. So why are we bowing down and saying, what is the West one?
Correct.
What should we make and export there? No.
Absolutely.
As Africa, together, and I think Zimbabwe is part of that, we should say to ourselves, you know what? Like the EU, like the America bloc, they go together as a bloc and they fight for what they want. Africans, we fight differently. I was giving you a good example. Why is us in Rwanda is a good example, fighting about what benefits we can give investors. We're actually competing with each other, right? We're competing with another African country to get a Western investor. That investor is going to love to come here. Why? Because he gets all the benefits.
Yeah.
We should be working together to make sure that our investment that comes to Africa is good for Africa, not good for an individual country. And I've always said this, regional African solidarity is what we need. And unless we do that, we're always going to be the ones that are dictated to, and we don't dictate. And I think that is key. It's enough. Those days are over. The days of what I can call, I'm not even to call it what, new colonialism. Is that the right way of putting it?
Neo-colonialism.
I suspect we're in danger of going down a rabbit hole where we discuss,
No, we don't want to go there.
Pan-Africanism and post-colonial
we don't,
Africa and global commodity markets. But look, we should have the rabbit hole one day because I think it'll be interesting.
I think so.
So from our first day, what's your takeaway? What gives you the most optimism from the conversations you are party to, and what gives you the most concern?
I think that the first optimistic thing is that it's clear that we're starting from such a low base that going upwards is pretty easy to a certain degree. Yeah, there's things that we can do, low-hanging fruit.
Stop digging. Don't use dynamite.
Yeah, basically, yeah. We can start off, and also we need to embrace things that matter right now in this world. Things like AI, algorithms, robotic trading. There's things that are real in this world, and we can't ignore them. As much as we want to think that we're Zimbabwe and we're unique, the fact is we're in a global financial market system. So I think my positive from all the presentations today was that we have products that we can produce. I mean, Simba talked about our natural resources. We can be looking at green bonds. We can look at climate type of instruments, debt instruments, and of course, we'll talk about his business, what he can do in terms of the companies that can come on board to strengthen our capital markets. I think one of the things that I won't call it a downer. I won't call it something which is insurmountable. Is that there's definitely a conversation that has to happen. And I think today was a great thing. With the Deputy Minister, David Mnangagwa here, it was clear that government, just as the President says, is willing to listen.
Yeah.
And I think that's key. It's the fact that we can access people and power, people that matter, and they'll listen to us. And I think that is what I'd like to build on. That was my major optimism today, that what, we do have issues. Everyone knows them, but we can solve them if we're willing to listen to each other and we trust each other.
Yeah.
And I think that's one thing I'd like to talk about a lot is trust.
Yeah.
Because we've had such a history of non-trust that there comes a point where you have to trust someone. You have to. Because at the end of the day, what other nation do we have? Where are we going? I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to go live in some funny country. This is where I live. This has to work. The question is can we put the brains together in Zimbabwe to achieve that objective, to make things work effectively? So today, there were, what did we do right? We put in new products. We put in new ways of trading. We put in simple trading, like over the app, you can trade your shares and so forth, okay? On the other side, of course, there's regulatory issues. There's issues that need to be addressed by government and the industry and get it going better. And so, in a way, for me, it's very positive. As much as, because remember, you have to look backwards and say, what did we do wrong, right? What could we have done better? But the trick, as you always say, is that you never repeat the past, you learn from it. We must learn from the past, understand that the way forward is together, not individuals. And government cannot ever do themselves things alone, because you know why? A lot of the good brains are not in government. They're not just in Zimbabwe, they're all around the world, Zimbabweans, wherever you may think. I mean, we've got guys like James Manika at Google AI. He's the boss of Google AI, and we're worrying about why do we not understand AI? Yet we have a Zimbabwean running AI. We have guys all over the world in major banks, in major construction companies. You name it, there's a Zimbabwean. So we need to harness that brain power and make sure that, you know what, because I tell you what, every Zimbabwean I've met, and I bet you guys will back this up, every Zimbabwean I met loves Zimbabwe.
Yep.
Without a shadow
we all
of
want the country
a
to succeed,
doubt.
for sure.
We want to succeed, and that's what we need to harness.
I'm gonna borrow from that theme, right? Because that is something that we discussed to some extent in terms of the trust or lack thereof between the government and the private sector.
Yeah.
And, you spent quite a bit of your career outside the country, and achieved success in places where the trains run on time and money comes out of ATMs, and power outages are rare, right? And so clearly, for you to actually come back and work with quasi-government businesses, you had to have some level of trust and confidence that, the conversation that you're having about what you're going to work on and try and build is earnest and sincere. So perhaps, some of what the government is bringing to the table in those conversations is not well known in the rest of the market.
Yes.
And perhaps many more people in the private sector would be really enthusiastic and anxious about knocking on government doors and saying, listen, we can work with you on this.
Yes.
We can work with you on that. We think, that these are the opportunities that we see to collaborate. But I think, to be fair, the perception and the mood for the most part in the private sector is that the government is inaccessible, that they're not progressive, they aren't actually interested in working with young, educated, energetic people. So you're like a caricature of the antithesis.
You're what we point to.
So what is it in? So perhaps maybe help our audience understand. The other side.
I think you've painted a picture of a government that I don't understand because I've not had that experience. Obviously, as you've rightly pointed out, I was educated in Zimbabwe. I went to university here in Zimbabwe, but I did leave immediately after for greener pastures. So the majority of my working life has been outside the country, right? I've only been back for probably 4 years this year, right? But I think that there's a difference between perception and reality. And I think when you're outside, your perception is exactly as you've described it, inaccessible government and those things. And perhaps that is true in some parts and for some people's experiences. My experience, certainly anecdotal as it may be, has been that I have managed to work with some of the most progressive people in government. Today we had a presentation from the Deputy Minister, and everybody that I have talked to after that was quite impressed by what he had to say and by the depth of the engagement that he showed to the audience. So my experience has not been like that. But having said that, I do accept that a lot of people's experience is one of an inaccessible government. And I think that it may be true for some people's experiences, but I also look at where I now work, Mutapa Investment Fund, and the things that the government, what the government has done in moving SOEs, previously underperforming SOEs, into a fund where they are required to show their performance for what they do and where they are judged on the merit of their performance, not on the patronage to a particular political figure. I think that is something that you could probably take as a positive to the accessibility of the government.
It's huge.
It's understanding of what the people of Zimbabwe need. Because SOEs are service providers to a large extent. That's why most SOEs must exist for service provision. First and foremost. We can then add others where we feel there are gaps in the market, but they must exist for that. And for a government to then decide that making them accountable to a high performance standard is what we want to do shows a certain level of accessibility.
Absolutely.
I can't say that it has been easy, but certainly my experience has not been one of an inaccessible government.
And I think it's important that government now, which is a difference to what we've seen in the past, government now understands that they don't know everything.
Agreed.
And that they're willing to listen and take good ideas in and adjust policy for that. And I think that's a paradigm shift in how we politically and socially and even financially operate in this country. Agreed. I think that's really key because at the end of the day, we had a situation prior whereby we all were screaming that this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. No one was doing anything. In fact, one of the major issues that comes out every time you talk about any new SI or any new regulation is how are we going to get around it? That's the first thought that every business has.
Yeah.
Okay, how are we going to get around it? Not understanding that maybe those policies are put in place for the good of all of us. Okay, so you have all these comments of profiteering, people making money, and things. We talk about black parallel market. The zig is another conversation we can have, and so forth and so on. But the fact is this: there has to come to a point whereby we need to accept what is good for us, what is good for our nation, but not blindly. We need to understand it through good research, through good arguments, and we need to articulate it to people. I'll give you a great example. Let's take Zig as a good example. Zig, for me, I think it's the way we need to go. I have no problem with it. My problem is the communication strategy around Zig. And I've said this to everybody. I've said that, you know what? If your communication strategy is bad, the message is bad. Okay, whether the product is good or not, right? And also as well, and I say this openly, there are people out there in our own country, our own Zimbabweans, who would like to destroy anything good.
Correct.
And I don't know why. I don't know why whenever you say something, this is what we're going to do, there's always going to be someone who criticizes you. I'm not sure why, and I'm not saying that everyone should get on the same bandwagon.
It's called 16 million people.
So, yeah.
Yeah, it is. In fact, it is a right. It is your right to disagree without explanation sometimes, and that's a good thing. We live in a society where you can probably, everybody looks at you and wonders, what is your problem? But you can actually voice that.
And that tells us our freedom.
Correct.
The trick now is that when they're good ideas, can we listen to them and implement them? And I think that is where the key comes in. And I think that we have entered a paradigm shift, as I said, in terms of how people are. I mean, look at the deputy minister today. You know, he sat with us and literally he spent, 4 hours talking to us and was very open, very candid. Things he couldn't do, things he could do,
we
things
had a
he
really
didn't
good
understand.
conversation. And I think we could go on and on here as well. But the producer over there is starting to throw a
Saying
tantrum.
game over.
An hour already?
Already?
Yeah,
we could have gone. You're right. We could have gone for another 2 hours.
Really?
Really? Hang on. Is that it? We're done?
My wine is not finished.
One beer
Well, now it
only?
seems like, what's going on
No.
over
What's
there?
going with this
Are you,
producer?
are you,
No,
is
fire
your watch
him.
working?
Fire the guy.
They're adamant that we've done a full shift.
All right.
So
Wonderful.
on that basis, we're going to bring you more conversations, hopefully.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Otherwise,
absolutely. Happy to come back.
wherever you are, cheers.
Cheers.
Yes.
Feel the joy from within with the new natural joy juice drink. Passion coconut, apple coconut, and lychee coconut exotic flavors. Available in 1 liter and 250ml packs at a store near you. Natural joy juice drink. Joy in every sip.
Welcome back. We're still out here in Nyanga and it's quite cold. And I've managed to corner two very interesting people, Valerie and Justin, to continue the conversation about our capital markets and where they're going, what they're getting right, what they're getting wrong. And you had a very interesting presentation today, Justin, where you articulated some of these things.
Okay.
So, in the spirit of just putting a more positive spin on things, perhaps you can start us off with the things that we're getting right.
So I think one of the things that we used to be as a market was very vanilla. We were just an equities market. That's all we were. And now we're talking about ETFs, we're talking about REITs, we're talking about CFDs, we're talking about debt. I think it's one of the things that it changed as a market, evolved as a market. We're not there yet in terms of taking it to the extreme in terms of being very successful, but I think it's something that we can be proud of. We're not as vanilla as we used to be. Boring. We're a boring market.
Yeah. I think it's very exciting, and I think we announced a new association, a capital markets association that brings together all the capital market players, and is going to lobby our government for the policy action that we want to see. And you're here, you're a banker, and I have a bone to pick with bankers because I felt that throughout our various currency crises, the bankers have never really pushed back and lobbied and argued as loudly as they ought to have. Are you guys going to be more aggressive in our coalition in the Capital Markets Association?
Oh my. Okay, what a question.
Very unfair one.
I think you'll actually be interested to know that we're very big on the lobbying. If I could, for example, just take out all the letters that have gone out from Bankers Association, just Bankers Association, for example, to the Ministry of Finance, to the Reserve Bank, you actually know that there's a lot of interaction that happens there. So for example, when this new SI came out with IMTT going back to 2% on the US dollar transactions, we were very quick to respond to that, to say, are we not then going towards facilitating disintermediation again, where people don't want to put their money in the banks because the cost of doing that and the cost of transacting just won't make sense. We do push, but I guess for the outsider, what they want to see is the outcome. And I think maybe for now, the outcomes haven't been great, as in there hasn't really been tangible change. But I think we've always been, the voice of the customer to the policymakers and to the regulators.
So perhaps I was a bit unfair in that sometimes there are a lot of conversations that happen behind closed doors where people have very frank and candid conversations that are uncomfortable, and substantive progress is actually made behind closed doors. And then in the public domain, we tend to be more polite, and it looks like to the average observer that, the bankers or CZI or whoever it is isn't actually pushing aggressively enough. But I think, across, the private sector, there is this perception, and I don't know to what extent it's valid, that the business community isn't really engaging. I don't know what you've made public statements and you've engaged privately.
Okay.
What's your sense?
Okay. So I remember when I joined a couple of years ago, everyone told me that you should not engage with government. It doesn't make a difference. It does make a difference. One of the things that you don't get credit for, like anything else in life, is what you prevent. There are things that will prevent happening, but you don't know about, and you won't talk about it. And there are things that we moderate that we don't talk about that happens. So over time, things will change. Like the things that people are complaining about now, we know they will change, and you just keep on talking to them.
I suppose one of the big challenges in Zimbabwe is the rate of change. Yeah. I think, when you think about the average person out there, you can say things will change, but I think it's so slow that for a lot of people, they start asking, will it happen in my lifetime? And, what impact is it going to have on myself, on my kids, on the generations to come? Is it going to come at a decent enough time that it can actually change our lives? And I think in that respect, maybe to say, yes, are we being aggressive enough? It could be a fair comment to say, can we not be even more aggressive? Just looking at the implications, looking into the future to say, what else can we do to really push for the change? I think there's always more that can be done. I think it's a fair comment.
Yeah. But also, there's a cultural element as well. Zimbabwean cultural element is if you are direct and very aggressive, people won't listen to you.
Okay.
It's one of those where you have to find the ways of saying what you are saying in a nicer way.
For sure.
It's just Zimbabweans. It's a cultural thing.
That's true.
If you say bad things about them in public, they will never listen to you.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I agree with you. I think to some extent it's cultural, but I also think there's another aspect of it where I think we have a psychological confirmation bias.
Okay.
So there's a cohort of Zimbabweans whose worldview, based on the last decades of our history, anything that government says or does must be bad, and it cannot be interpreted in any other way. And if you're interpreting it in a different way, it means you are bad too, or you have a problem. And then on the other end of the partisan spectrum is people saying, look, these are good, decent people, and they have our best interests at heart, and there's a lot more going on behind closed doors that the rest of us don't understand. And I don't subscribe to either of those views. I look at each policy action on its merits.
Yeah.
And if there's a policy action that I think is positive, I'm all for it, and I will applaud it. If there's a policy action that for whatever reasons I don't think is going to work, I'm able to criticize it without getting into personalities, or just in terms of just the the merits or lack thereof of a particular policy action. And when I have conversations in general, I feel I for the most part I meet people who are on one extreme or the other. It's very hard to have a conversation where we say, but you know what, that's actually a good policy. This can actually work.
Yeah.
Well, so how do we? What sense do you guys have in terms of just the, you know, the quality of the discourse? You know, how do we get people just to become more objective in whatever they're looking at and analyzing?
So I liked the Honorable Deputy Minister of Finance's position, where he said sometimes it's not so much about the policy being a problem in principle, but more of how can we refine the policy. So if we talk policy refinement, if we ask ourselves, I suppose the first step is to take a step back. A policy is introduced, maybe we're already overwhelmed by SIs, but let's say a policy comes in, rather take a step back and say, what is the objective or what is the thinking behind that policy? And then you say to yourself, if the principle, the objective makes sense and it is for the good of the market, instead of just criticizing it, why not then come forward and say, let's refine this policy by doing A, B, C, D, as opposed to this is nonsense, this is driving out investment, this is doing whatever. Let's look on the positive and say, okay, in principle, this makes sense. How do I work on it so that it makes even more sense and we enhance it so that for the markets, it actually makes sense and everyone can buy into it?
I think just add what she's saying. When you get it right and when the government believes that you're on their side, they then tell you these things before they come out to the public. And most of the time when something comes out that you don't know about, it means you haven't reached that level of trust that they have with you. Yeah. No matter they will tell you that we are thinking about the following, what do you think? And you can influence it. But no matter when things happen where you just surprised by an SI, I always say if you see an SI that surprises you, it means that they don't think
you don't have the relationship.
You don't have
and so I get the sense you've during your tenure have managed to build some bridges. What advice would you give to people in the business community who are frustrated by a whole bunch of policy action, who also want, to, instead of just whine and complain, who also are interested in engaging and having a seat at the table and having conversations that are constructive with their colleagues in government? What advice would you give them?
But I think at the end of the day, the government is made from human beings, made up of human beings. Everyone will listen to you if they think that at least you want them to succeed. So you have to be coming from a side where you are saying, you are trying to make them succeed, not make them not succeed. If they think you are trying to make them succeed and you say something, then at least they will listen. They might not agree, but they will listen. But if they think you don't want them to succeed, then they will not listen. That's what I would say. I think it took us a long time as an exchange in particular to be listened to. And we made a lot of effort in trying to make sure that we do things to help the government succeed. That's what helped.
So you're a banker, and I think one of the things that would make our country succeed is if we raised a bunch of capital, if we restructured our debt. We've got $2 billion that we need to raise to deal with food security. We've got all these infrastructure projects. We want to do Harare, Chirundu. We want to build out all these infrastructure projects. We need to raise a whole bunch of money for these projects to succeed. And so if you were in the room where the decisions were being made, what would your contribution be in terms of like what could we do if we were looking to raise $5-10 billion?
So when I look at Zimbabwe, and I know we actually had a presenter who was talking about our natural capital, I think from a distance, Zimbabwe is a very attractive investment destination. But when someone then goes into the detail, when you're now getting into the detail, you start saying, oh, but there's this policy, or this happened to so-and-so in this year, or whatever. So I would say there's no need to worry about trying to make Zimbabwe look good. The country itself, in principle, it's a no-brainer.
Yeah.
Now it's a question of what is it that has made us unattractive? And I believe that those are not difficult things to overcome. If it's about policies and there are policies that have issues, we can sit down and articulate, go one by one through those policies and see what needs to be done, what needs to be done away with, and what needs to be done to enhance certain policies to make this place attractive. If it's about governance, and I think we do have some governance issues where people then say, if I bring in my money is going to be diverted to something else, etc. But again, I don't believe that those are governance issues that we can't overcome, because we do have people who are also very good models of great corporate governance that are in Zimbabwe. So therefore, we can actually identify all those people, and we can actually also work on best practice wherever we need to instill that to make, those investment decisions easier for the people who have the money to bring it here. I've seen it happen in a very short space of time in certain countries. I don't need to mention names. We've all seen that happen. That 1 year they were blacklisted, but in a couple of years they're doing very well.
Yeah, the world is a changeable place. I mean, South Africa's on the grey list and we are not.
Exactly. Exactly.
Right. And yet South Africans can raise money from global capital markets much easier than we can.
Yeah.
So certainly I think, we're leaving a lot of money on the table.
Absolutely.
I personally believe that we could raise $5-10 billion easily if we had the right policy framework.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's building trust. Destroying trust is easy. Doesn't take a long time to sort out, but building trust takes a while. So all we need to do is, over time, we just need to build the trust. We need to be consistent. We need to keep our promises, and we'll get there. We'll get there. But people at the moment don't trust us. It's what it is. They don't. But we have to build the trust.
I think we need to be deliberate about it. Do we want these people? Do we want the money? Because I think if we wanted it, we would also be intentional about actions to make it happen. And I think sometimes we almost look and, scoff at it to say, oh, we don't need that money until we really need it.
But maybe part of the problem, it occurred to me during our deliberations throughout the day that maybe part of the challenge that we have is when we look at our capital markets in particular is we don't readily accept that a functional capital market could raise $5-10 billion. Like we don't when we think about the solutions to our national financial issues, the capital market doesn't seem like an obvious solution. In fact, my suspicion is that the capital markets has been viewed as a catalyst for bad behavior.
and it goes, even Bernard Chidzero, who do you think was a very progressive finance minister, was anti-capital markets. He was on record saying this is a haven of speculation.
Yeah.
So I think generally
and traders. So we've got a bad reputation. Basically, that's what you're telling us.
Yeah.
That we need to work on.
Yeah.
Because if globally, and I think I'm not sure if it was your presentation or someone else's where you pointed out that when you look at the market caps of African countries, debt instruments are actually
the largest,
the bigger portion, and it's government debt, right? And if there's a government in sub-Saharan Africa that needs to borrow cheap money right now, it's our government. So we would benefit a lot from a functional capital market that can raise money globally at decent interest rates.
Yeah. It's both sides. And I said it at the end where I said, like, our rules, for example, is the exchange. We're anti-government. We're more stringent on our government than any other exchange. So it's like both sides. And the government itself, when they look at our rules and their own thinking, they wouldn't come to our market. But most people will tell you government listings are automatic. The Reserve Bank is the sponsor. It doesn't have to go through a broker. I know you might not like it as a broker, but that's the norm.
Yeah,
the government
makes
also
sense.
Yes. Yeah.
Actually, in Kenya, the average man on the street through M-Pesa can buy government debt.
Yeah.
And but there's no here in our country you can't buy any kind of debt for any amount. On a platform like the equivalent would be EcoCash. So we've got a lot of work to do.
Yeah,
in the
but,
fixed
but,
income.
but even private sector, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but
you should no holds barred.
but companies but companies like self like cabs. If cabs was to issue a bond, that will be subscribed. Your reputation, your balance sheet, your income statement, and it's just the way Zimbabweans think about debt. I just find it difficult. They don't think about the mix. It's a mix. No, you don't think about the mix.
No, I'm listening.
Yes, it's a mix of your capital. So your capital has to be a mix of debt and equity. You can't have equity only. No. It's wrong. But Zimbabweans have got equity only. Look at Delta. Delta doesn't have debt. They don't think about debt. Maybe in square a little bit, but most very blue chip companies in Zimbabwe never borrow. And
if they don't want to list the debt. None of it is listed. No. I
It's
remember
a-
when I
it's a-
started out as
it's
a
a
stockbroker, we used
mindset.
to have preference shares, we used to have debentures.
Yes.
I mean, you guys, to your credit, at Victoria Falls Stock Exchange have done well with Caro, and I think that there's scope to raise much more money.
Yeah.
But I think it's a mindset.
Yeah, but think of your finance costs. Yeah. There's to be debt in your mix of.
It has to be there.
But do it. No.
But I think it's. I don't know, maybe it's a question to you. Do you think we have the sophistication that people can actually appreciate? Like to say, would I want to list my debt? What's the benefit? Do you think they actually have, do you think Zimbabweans have that appreciation?
For sure, Zimbabweans definitely have the sophistication. They definitely appreciate these things. I mean, if you look at the microfinance market and, the books out there in these firms where they're lending people money at 10-15% a month, right? And even that sector, they could benefit from creating paper that they list and they say, listen, I'm lending to the guy on the other side is at 10%, 15% a month. I'll give you 3%, 5% a month. Because if you are a retail fixed income investor in Zimbabwe right now, you can't get 3% a month. Where? There's no place where you can...
But anywhere in the world, where do you get 3% a month? Nowhere in the world do you get 3% a month.
You'll be lucky in some parts of the real world to get 3% a year.
Yeah, so that's why I'm asking to say, do you think people actually appreciate that this makes sense? Because why aren't we doing it?
No, so the man on the street is not going to invent the product, right? Yeah. It's a banker like you, and it's my job, and I'm probably doing a poor job on that front to convince you guys to actually, and it's Justin's job as well, to from his perspective, to convince you guys that look, there's the biggest bank in Zimbabwe right now is a national mattress bank, right?
Yes.
It's
Yes.
money in safes and under people's mattresses, and and most people, if they could deploy it somewhere where it actually earned a return, because by the way, the US dollar, even though it's a hard currency and people think it's fantastic, over a 20-year period, it actually loses 80% of its purchasing power.
It does.
So if you're just sitting on hard currency and it's not earning any interest, for 5 years, 10 years, you're actually losing significant value. So I think if the product was there and it was presented to the market, there would be takers.
So maybe what's lacking is that collaboration. To say, okay, the banks are there, you are there. What have we done together to make it work?
I think someone said it. Is the lack of investment banking in Zimbabwe. I hear KEBS is doing investment banking.
Yes.
So we're hoping that will make a difference. It's the lack of investment banking in Zimbabwe. People who create new products.
Yeah.
That's what we've been lacking. We've done a lot of work on our side as the exchange, but we shouldn't be doing some of the work that we're doing now. No. It should be coming from somewhere else, coming to us and say, I want this, I want to do this, I want to do this. What do you guys think? Yeah.
I think there's a lot of scope, and I think it's good to have these conversations and to meet and to brainstorm and to interrogate the problems and get insights and walk away with plenty of things to think about. And I hope our audience also benefits from our conversation and some of our provocative positions and is richer for it. So, thank you so much, Justin and Valerie, for indulging us here. And I think we've got another day where we will have a bunch of other guests that we will also have conversations with, that we will share with you, that we hope you find interesting. So, cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you.
Cheers.